Hi, everyone. As you all may know by now, my name is Rachel Craig. I am the program coordinator with the Office for Violence Prevention and Victim Assistance, and we are here with the third episode of Sexpectations. Today, we're talking about victim blaming and the intersections of survivorship. I am joined here by Natalie Akel from NJCASA, and I'm going to give her a chance to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that kind introduction. My name's Natalie. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the prevention specialist at NJCASA, which is the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So my role is to really help with implementing prevention programming, thinking about how do we keep violence from occurring in the first place. And I do that by working really closely with local preventionists who are all across the state, as well as professionals and providing training. Uh, Sorry if it's noisy. NJCASA is an incredible organization. So we're a capacity building and advocacy organization. So we represent the 21 counties sexual violence programs. So every county in New Jersey has their own program, as well as Rutgers VPVA. And we're super excited to announce that as of this year, we've added 8 new culturally specific organizations that will also be representing as part of our membership. So yeah, we're just so excited. And we do this work really by centering principles of anti-oppression, anti-racism, and envisioning a future where sexual violence does not exist.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for the work that you do. As you mentioned, Rutgers partners closely with NJCASA, and really their advocacy and activism has been so impactful for the state of New Jersey. I'm sure people watching are not up to date on the ins and outs of legislation in New Jersey, but NJCASA has been really impactful in pushing through survivor-led and survivor-centered legislation here. So we're so grateful for that, and so grateful to have Natalie here to be able to have this conversation with us. She's going to bring so much of her prevention expertise and background to being able to talk about our topic today. We're really going to be focusing on victim blaming. We're going to define it as a concept. We're going to talk about the origins of victim blaming, some of the background where victim blaming comes from. But we're also going to talk about who is impacted by victim blaming, how it impacts survivors, and how it can actually be, either a tool or something that makes it more difficult, or a barrier, right, for survivors to disclose experiences and receive those supportive services. They're out there, the supports are out there, but there are so many barriers, including victim blaming, that people don't want to or aren't able to reach out and be connected with those resources. So that's really what we're going to talk about, those roots, the impact, and the vulnerabilities of some folks to experiencing victim blaming. So when we talk about victim blaming, we're really talking about how some victims or survivors, typically of sexual violence or domestic violence, that broad spectrum of interpersonal violence, are often targeted for their perceived personal responsibility in being a victim of violence or a survivor of this kind of violence. It's something that's fairly unique in the field that we see compared to other victims of crime, right? So oftentimes people give the example of a robbery. You are often not putting any personal responsibility on the person who was violated in that way, whereas sexual violence or domestic violence, we often place personal responsibility on the survivor in that case. It's important to note when we're talking about this that it's extremely gendered, it's extremely racialized in that kind of personal responsibility. It's something that we put on people who have experience with interpersonal violence, because oftentimes they are women of color, they are queer people who are marginalized in society, right? And so we look at them and assign that personal responsibility. So we're going to talk about where those beliefs come from and how they impact people. Some people share that victim blaming can come from a place of distancing, right? Because these topics are really scary and difficult to talk about. People may find that victim blaming separates themselves from those experiences, right? So, oh, that could never happen to me because I do X, Y, and Z, and this person must have done something wrong. And so it's a form of distancing. Otherwise, it can be, with that very explicit malicious intent, or including those very specific biases about the communities who are impacted by interpersonal violence. Either way, regardless of the intent, regardless of where that's coming from, it can be really harmful, re-traumatizing for survivors, and it can hinder their ability to receive supportive resources. So all of that to say, that's kind of a really, really broad overview of our topic today. I could talk about this all day, but I'm going to start asking Natalie some questions so she has the opportunity to talk about it as well. So the first thing I want to talk about, right, is who can be impacted by victim blaming? How do we see it come up in everyday life or in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for that overview of victim blaming and how, certain communities are more impacted by this. I think you just gave so much good food for thought, especially in the sense of, victim blaming is asking, well, why did you do this? Or why did you not do this? Versus asking, why did this happen in the first place? And what allowed that violence to occur? And how can we keep ourselves safe from that occurring as a community moving forward? So for your first question, who can be impacted by victim blaming? Of course, and foremost, the survivor who's coming forward, who's trusting someone to share one of the most dark experiences in their lives, and then to have that be diminished or questioned or facing that blame. We know that can be re-traumatizing in and of itself. But also the people in communities, when we hear victim blaming becoming normalized, we think that's a proper response to when someone's coming forward. And like you said, it's very unique in the sexual violence, domestic violence realm that we put it on the victims or survivors to ask, well, why were you wearing this? Why were you out late? Whatever the questions might be that we know are just so harmful, because we should be asking, why did this violence occur in the first place? And so we see it in so many different ways, and examples you mentioned for, maybe someone coming forward and someone just trying to distance themselves, like, oh, I'm sure they didn't mean to do that, right? Something that their intent might not have been to be completely dismissive. But then we also see it on larger scales, when we're in courtrooms and we see it, or on the media, and maybe people speculating and having conversations about why did this happen. And so yeah, we just see it on a lot of different scales, from individual all the way up to Dr. Ford being questioned by Congress, and us having to see that as something like a rational thing to do instead of just believing her.
Yeah, absolutely. That offers so much key insight, I think. We have talked about within our Rutgers Newark community this spectrum of violence that we see, and it really talks about or encompasses what we consider rape culture, is that normalization of
Mhm.
this victim blaming, those statements, that distancing or dismissiveness. And the personal is absolutely political, right? And so the way that we are talking about these things to our friends, to our larger communities, in our peer groups, to our family and loved ones, that really permeates the way that we're talking about it, like you mentioned, on those larger scales, because ultimately the people who are lawmakers, who are congresspeople, who are our politicians, who are shaping the broader culture, our broader society, are impacted by those micro interactions that we're having, and the way that we're talking about, survivorship. So I really appreciate you making that connection for us. So I want to talk a little bit about, how victim blaming has evolved potentially. We're seeing it in our day-to-day lives now versus, at the start of the anti-sexual violence movement and the different challenges that we're facing. So with that, have you noticed any change in the way sexual violence has been talked about, either within the field of support services that you are operating in and in the general public, in our community spheres? Specifically, in the past 5-10 years now, I realize that we're in 2024, which is bananas, that there have been these high profile, specifically celebrity cases, like you mentioned with Dr. Ford. How has that changed, or how are we seeing victim blaming come up?
Yeah, oh, there's so much to unpack. And I think that with the Me Too movement, it's gone on like all forms of the spectrum, in really positive ways. I think that people do feel that this is an issue we can talk about as a society and as a community, but I do think there has been almost backlash to the Me Too movement, in the sense that I don't know if you've ever heard, it's like now become, I guess, a verb, like, oh, he got Me Too'd.
Yes, yes.
And it's that language really bothers me because it's almost making the person who committed violence or harm or perpetrated it into now like they've had something done to them, and that it's this fear mongering, like, oh, don't speak to that person because you're gonna get Me Too'd, versus how do we teach so that our actions don't lead to someone being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed in the workplace or on the street or in their homes. So that is something, like, language wise, that I really think about a lot, and the sense that the speculation is always on the survivor, on the victim. What were they doing? Who was it? And yeah, just like this constant questioning. And, I'm thinking of, some of the names you brought up earlier, like Brett Kavanaugh, R. Kelly, in the pre-interview questions. And yeah, it's just really interesting how all of so many of these major cases have become a spectacle in our media. But at the same time, it seems like we've also come to a little bit of a crossroads in how do we move forward from this in a way that isn't only relying on systems of punishment, but what can accountability look like in a different sense than maybe just the criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. So many great points that you brought up that were sparking things in my mind too, right? Focusing on that accountability and survivor-led accountability, what justice looks like for survivors, and that might not be involvement with the criminal justice system, is something really important to consider. And also, you mentioned, right, these media spectacles that have happened that have made all of us observe and share our opinions, right? Good or bad, opinions that may be triggering to some. And I think it has created this environment where a few things have happened. One, we've noticed directly with our student populations that people are saying or seeing these situations and these highly publicized trials or things like that and saying, well, I didn't have that experience, so they kind of invalidate their own experience as saying, I'm not going to make a disclosure because, it's not really that bad, quote unquote. And we want survivors to know that their experiences are valid and their feelings are valid, and that they can still receive services if it doesn't look exactly like what's happening in the news or the coverage that we're seeing. Is something that we find really important to emphasize as well. And that, the other avenue I think we're seeing is that because these things are highly publicized, we're seeing that victim blaming being elevated and talked about more, talked about on social media, talked about in dinner table conversations, right? We're seeing that because it's so permeated in everyday life, we're seeing more and more people talk about situations that are nuanced, or they have no idea the people involved. Like most of us have no idea the people involved, and yet we still assign that personal responsibility.
Yes, we've always put responsibility on the survivor, whether it's to report or to report sooner or to prove what happened once you are in that court system. And so I just totally echo what you're saying. Survivors need to be able to choose for themselves what justice looks like for them and to do so in a safe way, but we know that justice can look so different depending on the communities who has access to justice, whether there's victim blaming within that trying to come forward. So yeah, no, I just wanted to share that point.
Yeah, thank you. And the other thing I've noticed, I think, in the past few years, even decades, right, since the inception of the anti-sexual violence movement, is who we consider and allow and recognize to be victims or survivors, and then how we change that personal responsibility, I think, and the language that we use around that. As you mentioned, right, in some of these high profile cases, it's less, what were you wearing, or you being out, so why were you out so late, or why were you in that place? Those things that we may have heard before, but now it's more, oh, this person's in it for the money. Right? Especially like you were talking about, this person got Me Too'd. That assigns a specific intention to the survivor. Like they're doing it for some kind of personal gain, which I think has been an interesting shift that we've seen in the way that victim blaming presents itself. The other thing I think that has changed too is originally the anti-sexual violence movement did not include queer survivors, did not include male survivors. And so there's a lot of victim blaming for those communities specifically too. And that looks different as well, right? For male survivors, regardless of the person who caused harm, gender identity, there's a lot of, well, you're a man, how could this have happened to you? And so there's really specific victim blaming around different communities, I think, that go into our beliefs and our biases about gender and things like that. So one thing I do want to talk about, because you've been so apt to mention the larger legal system, the criminal legal system and things like that. Have you noticed, and maybe you have this experience through NJCASA or through your previous programs, right? But do you notice any public policy or social programs that are reinforcing victim blaming and increasing those barriers for survivors? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I really thought about this question because I think it has so much in it. So we know that sexual violence, right, doesn't just occur. There's things that make communities or people more likely to experience violence or harm or perpetuate it. And we know that some of these things are rigid gender norms, poverty, homelessness, all these things. So I think for me, it's almost a lack of social programs when it comes to housing, housing, food security, all these different things that if there were more social programs in place, I think that would really elevate people to be safe within their communities, and that trickles down to being safe in their homes. So we do have public policy, you know, SASPA, the Sexual Assault Protection Act came out, I think 2016, and it was like a great way to create just an extra level of protection for survivors who maybe weren't in a relationship with the perpetrator. But at the same time, it still puts the burden on the survivor to prove certain things, to go speak to a judge, to you know, relive what happened to them. So even if things are there to support survivors, we still put a big burden on them. And so for me, it's really about, well, how do we create an environment that really works against the conditions that allow sexual violence to occur in the first place?
Yeah, that's such great points. That And I love that you come at it from your prevention specialist lens, right?
I can't help it. I'm a prevention geek.
But it's so true, right? What can we do to prevent violence from happening in the first place and help create community involvement and a sense of community and belonging where these things don't happen? And if they do happen, there are a lot more support services offered and accessible, right? That don't place the burden on people who have experienced harm. And like you mentioned, that, you know, just because something isn't explicitly directed at anti-violence policies doesn't mean it can't contribute to that, right? So housing security, food security, reproductive justice, like all of these things can really significantly impact the number of people that are impacted by sexual violence, that can reduce those vulnerabilities. And so those are actually things that we can focus on and that do help to advocate for anti-violence, even if it's not like the most explicit thing within that policy or within that legislation.
Yeah, well, NJCASA works on a lot of survivor-centered legislation. And so, you know, I think it's important just in all facets of society, we're centering survivors, we're centering those that have been harmed or who are likely to experience harm, because that makes it safer for everyone. If those who are most marginalized are protected, then I think that has a way of rippling out so that everyone can benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that so beautifully leads into my next question for you, which, you know, what is the relationship, if there is a relationship, between marginalized identity and victim blaming?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The relationship between marginalized identity and victim blaming. Well, we know that victim blaming can happen to anyone, to any survivor who comes forward. But when you add certain identities that have historically been underrepresented, who have historically had less resources, who have faced racism and patriarchy, those all add on to barriers in coming forward in the first place. So the example I was kind of thinking of is, you know, we've heard the trope that like, oh, well, why didn't you report it? Right? Imagine asking that question, and it's bad either way, but asking that question to a cisgendered, Caucasian, highly educated person is different than asking that same question to someone who was formerly incarcerated, who's a Black woman, who's had their family facing police brutality, who's gone to the police before and was mistreated. And so we have to be thinking that because of the barriers in our society, because these systems of oppression, when we're thinking about equity, marginalized communities are already facing more barriers just because of these historical social systems in our society that already create those those certain barriers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it so closely ties in with what you were mentioning before, right? About how we can prevent violence by uplifting or helping to resource typically underrepresented communities and dismantling some of those systems, like you were talking about patriarchy or, the way that our current criminal legal system functions is a way of supporting survivors and minimizing
Mhm.
those impacts of victim blaming because it allows for, like you said, more equitable access for people who may not feel safe, reasonably so, by utilizing the current resources that we offer for survivors to receive justice.
Absolutely, just letting my fire truck pass by. But what that's why I love that NJCASA is moving forward with culturally specific programs in our membership because, we know that, maybe a sexual domestic violence agency might not always be who's serving specific populations, but so the fact that we can have specific organizations also having that information and training around sexual violence prevention, domestic violence prevention, it allows us to ask what the community's needs are versus programs just expecting themselves to be safe for everyone.
Mm.
Because we know, for the first wave of like white feminism, we know that shelters were really for heterosexual cisgendered women, and so that really created barriers for men, for the LGBTQ community, for disabled folks, and again, a lot of times these identities, people don't just hold one identity. We're all a complex constellation of different things that make us who we are. So if we have compounding identities that have been marginalized, it makes it that much more difficult to come forward. So just creating safe spaces that people feel they can be their authentic selves in is really important.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we're definitely going to include those resources, in our posts. And at the end, I'd love to talk more about them too, because like you said, there are resources, but that doesn't mean all of them are culturally specific or coming from an anti-oppressive lens that really help
Mhm.
survivors feel safe disclosing these really momentous experiences of trauma that they have had or their families have had or they have witnessed and allowing them to steer the conversation and steer the management of their own life into what's going to be most helpful for them at that time. So I think that's awesome. And I'm so excited to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's really exciting.
So the last thing I really want to talk about is, changing victim blaming perspectives to be more oriented towards support for survivors and like we were talking about that accountability for people who cause harm, right? So what do you feel like can be done as individuals about this, right? About changing that culture but also from a macro or societal standpoint, like how can we as just us ourselves do something, and how can a society or a culture kind of help jumpstart that shift?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a complex thing, right? But as individuals, I think the first thing to do is to be opening to questioning. Oh, questioning why joke? Was that joke funny? Probably not. No, maybe I should say something to my friend about it. Or, if you're with friends and they're making fun of what someone's wearing, right? It's these little things that maybe in the moment don't seem harmful, but that could really impact our view of how we see others and make us feel different than them. Like, oh, they did something that made the violence happen versus realizing we're all vulnerable to violence, and we're also all capable of creating societies that are resilient to violence and safe. And so we know that like those certain protective factors you might hear me talking about, but things like rigid gender norms, really having places and spaces to talk about that, to break it down in a safe way. Because if you've been told the same thing your whole life, it might really take a while to really deconstruct and not feel judged. So creating spaces for education early on too, we like children can be taught consent as early as like 2, 3 years old. So just realizing, this is so corny, but like our children are our future. They do hear what we're saying. They do hear how we're talking about people or questioning people. And I think that goes into the larger macro scale of preventing victim blaming, which is education around what sexual violence, interpersonal violence, gender-based violence is. What are the circumstances that allow it to happen in the first place? I mean, I'm all about prevention, first and foremost. And I think that comes with education and talking to people, not just about what is sexual violence, but what are healthy relationships? What's consent? What does consent look like in different kinds of settings? Yeah, so just really having a cultural shift, because as you mentioned before, we do live in a rape culture that does normalize certain acts of violence, and specifically towards certain groups of people, Black women, brown women, people of color, the LGBTQ community. They have faced discrimination, and we have to have that in the conversation. That's why so much of the work NJCASA does is we realize we can't just end sexual violence just by talking about it. It's also by talking about anti-oppression, talking about dismantling racism, and then rebuilding these systems using the indigenous wisdom of the people and communities already here. So really taking away from that top-down approach of like, I'm going to teach you this and then you're going to be safe, but also going into communities and saying, what do you need to be safe? Because that might look really different than what I'm thinking. I might think safety to you means learning the definition for consent, but I might go and talk to a community and they might say, safety for me actually means like having some grocery gift cards because I haven't been able to eat and I'm nervous how I'm going to get food. And so really, really just taking the community's needs into our hearts and moving from there.
Thank you so much. I'm not even gonna try to add anything to that because I think it was such a great summation of what we're talking about when we talk about dismantling that rape culture and interrupting those things individually and on a larger scale, and reflecting on our community needs and really building from there. So thank you so much, and for emphasizing the work that NJCASA is doing. If you could, tell me about who can benefit from your services, tell me about those major projects and those specific groups. I would love to hear more about them and how people can get in touch with your agency.
Yeah, so who can benefit from our services is really everyone. We do a lot of work to change systems, to work with professionals, and to teach, but also individuals can absolutely benefit. If not from our services, every county has a sexual violence program. And so I just want to make sure that anyone listening to this phone call who identifies with anything being said, the advocate in me just has to say that we believe you, we are here for you, you are not alone. And if you're listening to this and thinking of something, we have a 24-hour or a hotline number you can call, and all the counties have their own hotline numbers too. So I do just really want to share that and really, really emphasize to anyone who has been harmed by victim blaming that we believe you and it was not your fault. And then, so NJCASA does have some really cool projects coming up that we would just love for everyone to get involved with. So we are hosting a conference on May 8th and 9th. It's called the Creating Transformative Systems Conference. I've gone to the conferences in the past, and they are just food for thought. You get so many great things to think about, listen to so many great speakers. And we're very, very excited because our keynote speaker this year is the author of My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, Resma Menachem. So really excited about that. Again, that's on May 8th and 9th, and registration will be opening shortly. It's virtual, so please, register if you'd like to come. And then we're also doing an open house for NJCASA at our new location in Trenton. That will be on February 29th, Leap Day. We're already making a lot of frog jokes at the office.
Love it.
Yeah, so that will actually be in person. We'll be having just inviting the community to come learn about what we do and to network. So that's on February 29th. Registration will be opening for that as well. And yeah, we're really, really excited for our conference. So please come.
Yeah, we'll definitely put all of links and information to your newsletter and to where to find those registrations when
Perfect.
they become live, so everyone can get involved with that. I have also been to those conferences in the past, and they really, really are transformative. I think
Yes,
that's such a great name for the conference because you do you have your eyes opened, I think, to a lot of things you may not have thought about in the past. And it's such a great learning opportunity, whether you're in the field or not, or you just want to learn more about these things. You will absolutely take something away from it. I can guarantee that. Not knowing anything about the conference, I can guarantee you'll take something away from it. So thank you. Thank you for that. Is there anything else you wanted to share? Anything about, your resources, your social media? We'll also link all of those things so you can easily find them, but anything else you want to share with us?
Yeah, I'll quickly just say, our website is njcasa.org. Instagram is nj_casa. Please give us a follow. And there is a statewide hotline. And we're happy to connect you with your local sexual violence program. And yeah, my final thoughts will always be with survivors. Thank you again for listening to this, and just reiterating that you're not alone. There is support out there, and it was not your fault ever, no matter what. And so thank you so much, Rachel, for creating this dialogue and this opportunity to have such an important conversation.
Yes, Natalie, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for lending us such amazing wisdom and thoughts and your expertise. I hope everyone did also take something away from this. If you have questions, I will include the information for VPVA to reach out to us. All of the information Natalie mentioned for NJCASA to reach out to them, or to the hotline, which can direct you to the most appropriate service or resource if you have experienced interpersonal violence or want to learn more about your individual community and their prevention efforts. So thank you so much for joining us.